Hi, today I will talk about one of the most beautiful stories I have ever read in Arabic literature. The case of the animals versus man before the king of the Jinn is an amazing fable written in the 10th century by the Iraqi Brethren of Purity, Ikhwan al-Safa. It is originally titled in Arabic as في أصناف الحيوانات وعجائب هياكلها وغرائب أحوالها, on the categories of animals, the wonders of their forms, and the marvels of their conditions. But the English translator chose this poetic title for it. The story is quite long, consisting of about 200 pages, and it is difficult to summarize as it should be because I believe every sentence is a beautiful masterpiece, craftily organized. Yet, in the following, I will try to summarize the most relevant parts of the story. After that, I will attempt to explain the ending, which seems ambiguous to many people. The story is essentially about a group of token animals who testify against humans in a session chaired by the ruler of the Jinn. Although the framework story generally explores the creation of humans and how at first they were afraid of animals but eventually began to enslave them, causing the animals to flee. The turning point occurs when 70 men are shipwrecked on an island inhabited by animals who had fled from the descendants of Adam to avoid abuse and exploitation. Believing the animals to be their slaves, the men attempt to subjugate them. The animals demand justice, and thus a trial is convened by the island's Muslim governor and the king of the Jinn. The humans are generally represented by 7 spokespeople who unconvincingly argue that mankind is superior to animals. On the other hand, the animals, led by various representatives, cleverly refute each argument presented by the humans. The king of the Jinn declares that only philosophical and theological arguments will be accepted in the trial. As a result, both animals and humans use reason and religious arguments to defend their cases. For example, among the many arguments humans presented to justify their claim of mastery over animals, they cited verses from the Quran in which God says that animals are among his signs, which humans can use to make their lives easier. However, the animals' spokesman provided explanations and analyses to demonstrate that such verses do not imply that animals are slaves to humans. For instance, God says he, quote, subjected them, meaning the animals, to you, end of quote, just as, quote, he subjected sun and moon, the wind and clouds, end of quote. This, however, does not mean that these heavenly bodies are the slaves of humans. Likewise, the humans argued that their upward stature, in contrast to the animals' downward posture, signifies that they are masters and the animals are their slaves. Again, the animals' spokesman refuted this, explaining that God created them in this way for the practical benefits, not for the purpose that humans had assumed. Then the Iraqi spokesman spoke about their unique features, saying that they had prophets among them and many great wise kings, etc. And that this proves that they are special and superior to animals. However, the forthright Jinni, who respects nothing but complete truthfulness, responded by pointing out that what the Iraqi spokesman failed to mention is that in their land the great flood occurred. Human discord arose, and confusion of both mind and heart spread in a bubble of misunderstanding. He also noted that the Iraqi speaker did not address how they had mistreated their prophets or how they had tyrannical kings, among other things. After refuting the Iraqi man's claim, the forthright Jinni said something very important. Quote, "It is not proper in law and equity, to count and vaunt one's virtues but omit one's failings without even trying to repent or excuse them. End of quote. However, after that, the Indian man presented similar proofs to demonstrate their special qualities, stating that they had many wise men and that they were gifted in magical sciences and are famously known for never fearing death, traits he claimed marked them as masters. But the Jinni reminded him that they had also been guilty of burning bodies and worshipping idols, among many other things. In this way, the Indians' argument of superiority was refuted. Next, the Hebrew from Syria spoke about how God had honored them by sending many prophets with holy books. He also mentioned how God split the sea for Prophet Moses and drowned Pharaoh and so on. However, the Jinni reminded him of their wrongdoings, including how they became worshippers of the Taghut, among other faults. Thus, this argument was also refuted. Then the Syrian Christian spoke about how they were blessed by Jesus, who was born of the Virgin Mary, empowered by the Holy Ghost, and performed miracles. He also mentioned how they had humble priests and monks among them. Referring to what the Quran says about them, he added, quote, God instilled compassion, mercy, and rahbaniyah, meaning monasticism, in our hearts. End of quote. However, the forthright Jinni reminded him that they had failed to care for this great divine gift as they began to claim that God was one of the three, started eating pagan, and engaged in other unacceptable actions. Next, the Qurayshi man spoke about how God had sent the Prophet Muhammad among them. He praised the companions of the Prophet, the angels, the previous prophets, and the righteous people. He also spoke about how they were chosen for Islam and honored by the Quran, as well as by Islamic practices such as fasting in Ramadan, paying alms, performing ablutions, praying in mosques, and so on. Furthermore, the Quraysh man explained how they were taught the ethics of the prophets and the righteous, and how they were informed about the next world, the day of judgment, and promised the rewards of martyrs and virtuous people, as well as eternal life in heaven. But the wise Jinni pointed out that the Qurayshi man had neglected to mention that after the Prophet's death, they had failed to uphold his teachings. Some became hypocrites, doubting what the Prophet had taught, and others took advantage of the religion to kill virtuous people for earthly gains. Then the Greek man spoke about how they were chosen among nations for their wisdom and special ability to reason, and how they mastered various sciences such as medicine, geometry, astronomy, mathematics, logic, and more. However, the wise Jinni told him that they had originally acquired these sciences about which the Greek man was boasting from the Jews and Egyptians, and then they attributed them to themselves. Next, the man from Khorasan spoke about how God had honored them by giving them a great climate and nature, where markets and buildings flourished. He explained how they were gifted with exceptional physical strength, presented sayings from the Quran and Hadith praising the Persians. In short, the Khorasani spokesman highlighted their well-known tendency to embrace faith without deeply questioning or delving into the specifics of their religion. He also mentioned how they sought revenge for Hussein, peace be upon him, and fought against the family of Marwan, who did not follow God's commands. The man from Khorasan added that they are the ones awaiting the emergence of Al-Mahdi from their country. All these unique merits, he claimed, imply their high status. But the wise Jinni pointed out that they also have rude natures, foul tongues, the habit of having sex with boys, marrying their mothers, worshipping fire, and other faults. In short, all the arguments presented by the humans asserting their supremacy over animals were refuted by the wise Jinni. This demonstrates that the positive qualities the humans boasted about do not alleviate their status, as they also have negative qualities. At any rate, later the frog explained how humans who eat animals are themselves eaten by worms and other insects after their death. Therefore, the frog concluded that humans have nothing special to boast about. Elsewhere, the king of the Jinn asked why animal groups have one king for each species, while humans have many. The Iraqi spokesman responded by talking about the variety of professions and careers among humans. They have, for example, clerks, administrators, tax agents, landlords, farmers, judges, jurists, and so on. These people, asserted the Iraqi man, maintain the economic and religious stability of the country. Then the bee spoke about how they were inspired by God to create their hives in the best geometric shape and how they were given the ability to find the best plants. The bee also pointed out that humans depend on what comes out of their bowels, while bees never need human beings. The bee then asked, how can humans think that animals are slaves to them when their own behavior asserts the opposite? Another interesting issue raised in the session was the fact that animals, jinn, angels, stars, and others perfectly obey God's command, which stands in contrast to humans who disobey God and mistreat their prophets and virtuous people. After all their rude and ignorant behavior, humans still claim that they are masters and animals are their slaves. Afterward, the representative from Byzantium spoke about their extensive knowledge in various sciences, their keen discernment, refined reasoning, and effective governance. He highlighted their remarkable ability to manage their lives and excel in arts, industries, commerce, and trade, as well as their approach to both worldly and spiritual matters. He concluded that all these achievements support their claim of being masters with animals as their subordinates. The bee's spokesman refuted that claim by explaining the intricate order and teamwork within the bee kingdom, where they receive direct guidance from God instead of relying on teachers. The bee provided several examples from other insects such as ants, locusts, and silkworms, whose teamwork methods of building their homes and seasonal care for food demonstrate their remarkable intelligence. The bee then questioned why humans boast over animals when their finest food comes from the bees' bowels, and their best clothing is made from the silkworm's silk. It is therefore humans who seem to rely on animals, not the other way around. Then a Bedouin among the humans claimed to have proof of a human's superiority, citing their enjoyable lives, refined lifestyles, and the variety and richness of their foods and drinks. According to the Bedouin, all of this demonstrates that they are masters, while the animals' simple and unrefined food signifies their status as slaves. However, one of the animals countered that the Bedouins' argument actually worked against the humans. The animal explained that God would likely judge them harshly for such a lavish lifestyle. In contrast, animals have simple, easily obtained food because they eat only to survive, without greed or access. Humans, on the other hand, often squander time seeking the most prestigious food even if it means harming others or neglecting what pleases God. In contrast, animals treat food naturally without making it their primary focus, which suggests they are free beings, not slaves. The animal's spokesman also pointed out that while humans indulge in luxurious meals, they often suffer from the negative consequences of their excessive eating, such as diseases. Then he quoted a Quranic verse that criticizes humans. Quote, "Man indeed was unjust and ignorant." End of quote. As for human spokesman's boasting about their celebrations, parties, banquets, dancing, weddings, entertainments, jewels, and the like, claiming that these things are uniquely human and thus demonstrate their special nature, the animal's spokesman explained that all of these can be used against the humans. He pointed out that for every positive aspect, there is a negative counterpart. For example, alongside weddings, humans have funerals. Alongside celebrations, they have grief. Alongside music, there is wailing. Alongside laughter, there are cries. And alongside large meeting places, there are small dark coffins, fetters, and chains, etc. In short, for every joy, there is something terrible to match it. Unlike humans, animals are free to roam nature and eat what God has allowed them, which reflects a free creature, not a slave. Moreover, God would punish humans who exceed in indulging in these behaviors. Therefore, the humans' argument was turned against them. Then another man spoke to highlight more human achievements that supposedly distinguish them from animals, thus demonstrating their mastery over them. He mentioned how God sent prophets among them, provided divine books, and taught them religious rules. What is halal and what is haram. He also spoke of how God taught them the practices of cleanliness through ablution, fasting, and prayer. All of this, he claimed, shows that they are special and superior. However, the bird's delegate countered that these practices actually work against the humans rather than in their favor. He explained that these acts are punishment and methods of purification meant to keep humans away from sin. The bird quoted the Quran saying, quote, "The prayer prevents indecency and abomination," end of quote. End quote. "The good deeds remove the evil deeds," end of quote. The bird concluded by noting that since animals are free from such sins, God did not require them to follow ritualistic method of self-purification. The bird added that God had sent his prophets and messengers only to wicked and ignorant peoples. In short, the bird explained that the humans were sent prophets because they had altered God's laws and defied his commands, and so on. The bird also said that prophets are the physicians and astrologers of the soul. However, since animals don't suffer from such soul diseases, God did not send them prophets. Likewise, the bird explained that ablution and cleanliness were imposed on humans to purify their bodies due to what happens in them, such as the emergence of stinking sweat, especially as a result of the effects of sex. The bird also pointed out the practical and self-purifying reasons behind prayers, fasting, charity, and alms taxes. As for the divine books about which the human had boasted, the bird's spokesman said that they are like fetters imposed on humans by God, who knows their ingratitude and bad tendencies. Given that animals behave according to God's order and inspiration, they didn't need them. The bird quoted the Quran, quote, "And your Lord inspired the bee, saying, take your habitations take your habitations in the mountains and in the trees and in what they erect. End of quote. And quote, each instinctively knows their manner of a prayer and glorification. End of quote. The Iraqi man then spoke, offering additional signs of a human's supremacy to prove that they are masters and animals their slaves. He highlighted their fine clothing, elegant garments that shield their nakedness, soft cushions, plush bedding, and luxurious comforters. He also mentioned their intricate silk and fancy fabric decorations, along with raw silk, damask, and cotton and so on. Whereupon the delicate of the beast of prey explained how humans' clothes are actually derived from animals, and how the very basic material of their finest fabrics is taken from the spittle of worms. Moreover, the jackal asserted that it is the animals who should be proud of having natural clothes given to them by God on the day of their birth, without the need to steal them from others or to work hard in spinning, weaving, and cutting them. When one man criticized the jackal, the latter delved deeply into the bloody history of mankind's brutality against both animals and each other, proving that even animals do not treat each other the way humans do. After that, the spokesman of the carnivores argued that predators are actually better than humans. He said that the highest rank among humans consists of ascetics, holy men, monks, rabbis, and mendicants. And when any of these people reach the highest level of goodness, they desert human society and flee to a faraway mountain, valley, seashore, or cave, choosing to live among beasts that will not harm them. Therefore, if beasts were not better than humans, the most saintly of people would not choose to live with them. The best seek the best and flee from the evil. The jackal presented another proof to support the claim that beasts are better than humans. He said that when human tyrants doubt the goodness of a saintly man, they throw him to the beast of prey. If the beast refuses to harm him, the tyrants will not kill him, for only the good can recognize the good. With this, the king of the jinn was very pleased, and the humans were greatly humiliated. The session that day ended. On the following day, the Parisian spokesman spoke up, listing the various roles and professions humans hold: kings, princes, caliphs, sultans, chiefs, wazirs, clerks, ministers, chamberlains, notables, nobles, privy councillors, merchants, artisans, farmers, landowners, cultured and learned individuals, pious and virtuous people, eloquent speakers, orators, poets, theologians, reciters of scripture, storytellers, narrators of traditions, scholars, jurists, judges, magistrates, philosophers, astronomers, naturalists, physicians, diviners, enchanters, dream interpreters, alchemists, talisman makers, astrologers, logicians, and many others. The Parisian concluded that all of these roles are unique to humans, further proving that humans are masters and animals are their slaves. The parrot replied by saying that the speaker should consider the other side of the matter. That is, for every positive distinctions highlighted by the Parisian, there is an equally terrible negative counterpart. For example, alongside all the various categories mentioned by the human, there are also pharaohs, Nimrods, tyrants, pagans, hypocrites, scoffers, traitors, defamers, backbiters, impostors, villains, whores, and so on. After listing many different types of bad humans, the parrot made an important point. Animals share many of the good qualities mentioned by the human, such as having kings, workers, builders, poets, and orators, etc., without sharing their opposite negative traits. Therefore, this implies that animals are better than human beings. The point is that when you have good features alongside their bad opposites, combining them together means you end up with nothing. I mean, given that the Brethren of Purity are very interested in mathematics, their minds seem to work in this mathematical way. After that, the parrot began criticizing the categories such as astrologers and their lies, philosophers and the endless disagreements among them, which push people away from God's straight path, whereas the point should be to bring people to God. Geometers who are skilled at measuring the outside world but fail to look within themselves, where the real signs of God can be found, and physicians who are a result of the sickness caused by humans' unnatural lifestyles. The bad behavior of merchants and their ilk was also criticized by the parrot. The parrot also criticized the so-called noble people, pointing out that if they were truly virtuous, they would have cared for the poor and lower classes of society. The scripture reciters and devout people were similarly criticized for being hypocrites, acting as if they are virtuous, but deep inside they are the opposite. The parrot said, quote, "Your scripture reciter and the devout that you count as the best among you, whose prayers you hope will be answered, and whose intercession you rely on with your Lord, why they are just the ones who have gulled you with outward shows of piety, humility, self-abasement, trimming their beards, cropping their sleeves, buckling on a belt and trousers, wearing coarse wool or hair, or patched cloaks, keeping long bouts of silence and following endless rules. Why forsaking all interest in the faith, neglecting study of the laws and usages of religion and of moral and spiritual improvement? They grow so obsessed with the mindless tally of their bows and prostrations that you can see the marks on their brows and the calluses on their knees." End of quote. To God, these people are evil, said the parrot, even if they appear virtuous in the eyes of humans. Jurists, clerks, and judges were similarly attacked for their hypocritical behavior, focusing on earthly gains rather than divine matters. The so-called caliphs, praised by humans as the inheritors of the prophets, were criticized for behaving like tyrants. They kill the saints of God and the children of the prophets. In short, while they give themselves such a sublime title, they do the most evil things toward God and their subjects. After this, another important issue was presented by humans to support their claim of mastery over animals: the unity of a human form, which stands in sharp contrast to the varied forms of animals. The human added that mastery and rule belong to unity, while servitude belongs to diversity. This argument was smartly turned against the humans by the spokesman of the birds, who said, even though the forms of animals are many, their souls are one, whereas humans have one form but many conflicting souls. The bird then spoke about the many different religions, sects, and schools of thought among humans, all contradicting each other. But unlike them, animals worship God in one unified way. The spokesman of the humans justified this by stating that all these different religions and sects are actually aiming at one goal, which is God. He quoted the Quranic verse, quote, Wherever you turn, there is the face of Allah. End of quote. The humans' spokesman then added that humans are much more numerous than animals in terms of nations and kinds, which implies their mastery over animals. But the frog refuted this by mentioning the various types of animals that humans are not even aware of. Then the wise jinn intervened, saying that neither humans nor animals have recognized the great numbers of jinn, angels, and devils occupying every place on earth and in the sky, yet they remain unseen. This means that boasting about numbers does not prove that they are masters or not. Then the orator from the Hijaz said that they have other distinctions that assert they are lords and that the animals are their slaves. Specifically, the promises that God gave them among all the living, such as being resurrected and brought forth from the graves, and the promise of the day of judgment, and the entrance to paradise, and so on. And as expected, the spokesman of the birds reminded him of the opposite cases of everything the human mentioned, such as the promises of chastisement in the grave, the interrogation by Nakir and Munkar, the terrors of Judgment Day, the strict reckoning, and so on. In other words, animals were not promised reward, but at the same time, they had no threat of punishment. Therefore, the evidence is balanced, and humans have no advantage over animals to be proud of whatsoever. Hearing this, the Hijazi man explained that they cannot be equal, because among humans there are, quote, prophets and their devisees, imams, sages, poets, and paragons of goodness and virtue, saints and their seconds, ascetics, pure and righteous figures, persons of piety, insight, understanding, awareness, and vision, who are like the angels on high. They quest after the highest goods, yearn after their Lord, turn to Him in all things, and ever hearken to Him. They look to Him, contemplate His greatness and splendor, trust Him in all things, beseech Him alone, seek Him alone, and hope in Him alone, since their care is His dread. End of quote. By the way, these details are different from one manuscript to another, but I used Goodman's translation. Then the animals delicate and the jinn sages all said together, quote, "Ah, humans, now at last you have come to the truth. You have spoken well and answered aright, for what you claim now is something indeed to take pride in. The deeds you cite are indeed worth performing. The lives and characters of these saintly persons, their manners and thoughts, the studies in which they are versed are indeed worth vying for. But tell us, O humans, of the qualities and lives of these persons. Inform us of their insights and ways, their virtues and godly doings. If you know aught of this, enlighten us about this if you can." End of quote. The whole body fell silent, pondering the question, but no one had an answer. And this is a very important detail. However, after that, we are told, quote, "Finally arose a learned, accomplished, worthy, keen, pious, and insightful man. He was Persian by breeding, Arabian by faith, a Hanafi by confession, Iraqi in culture, Hebrew in lore, Christian in manner, Damascene in devotion, Greek in science, Indian in discernment, Sufi in intimidations, regal in character, masterful in thought, and divine in awareness." End of quote. So this enigmatic man said, quote, "These saints of God are the flower of creation, the best, the purest, persons of fair and praiseworthy parts, pious deeds, merit sciences, godly awareness, regal character, just and holy lives, and awesome ways. Fluent tongues wary to name their qualities, and no one has adequately described their inmost core. Many have cited their virtues, and the preachers in public assemblies have devoted their lives down through the ages to sermons dilating on their merits and their godly ways without ever reaching the pith of the matter. End of quote. The English translation ends here, but in the Arabic edition, the final part mentions how the verdict was given to the humans. That's to say, the animals remained under the control of the humans until a new age dawns. However, at this point, they would have a new fate. In fact, the reason for making this study is basically to try to explain the ending part of the story, because many studies I came across regarding this story refer to what they found to be an ambiguous ending. I read what I was able to find online about this story, such as two articles, the English translation by Goodman and MacGregor, and its commentary, knowing that I used their English translation, and a presentation video. All these scholars made interesting studies about this story, yet I don't totally agree with them about the ambiguity of the end. To me, the ending seems logical. Maybe I'm wrong, but I will try to explain my reasoning regarding this issue. For example, Dr. Ozgan, whose study of this tale is both enlightening and original, said regarding the trial, quote, "It ends abruptly, suddenly, and I don't see the logic of the judgment." End of quote. Also, regarding the final proof presented by the Hijazi man, he said, quote, "The humans were repeating the same thing from the beginning of the abstal, but I say maybe the Ikhwan decided that how are you going to end this abstal? Let's say something and let animals accept these things." End of quote. Another scholar in the same video I'm referring to made an insightful comment about the ambiguous ending of the story. He said that although the ending seems to repeat the same point, it focuses on actions. In other words, unlike animals who worship God by default, humans can do so by free choice, a perspective with which the presenter agreed, suggesting that this makes the ending less surprising. As for Dr. Talili, allow me to read a long, relevant paragraph from her important study, in which she also quoted the ending part of the story. She wrote, quote, "Astonishingly, rather than engaging with this theme," meaning the theme of afterlife, "the human characters strike their winning point simply by re-invoking a number of arguments that have already been refuted. The Hijazi delegate exclaims in what appears like an exasperated tone, How are we? How are we equal? How do we stand on a par when we have among us prophets and their devices, imams, sages, poets, and paragons of goodness and virtue, saints and their seconds, ascetics, pure and righteous figures, persons of piety, insight, understanding, awareness, and vision, who are like the angels of high. They quest after the highest goods, yearn after their Lord, turn to Him in all things, and ever hearken to Him. They look to Him, contemplate His greatness and splendor, and trust Him in all things, beseech Him alone, seek Him alone, and hope in Him alone, since their care is His dread." The reader will readily note that every point made here has already been refuted. The presence of prophets has been taken as a sign of a human's immorality rather than virtue. Saints were said to prefer the company of other animals to the company of their own species members. Insight and discernment proved to be common to all non-human animals and scarce among humans, as are adoration of God, and abstention from assigning partners to him. Moreover, the logic underlying this claim is unclear. If most members of the human species are immoral, confused, and ignorant, as one understands from the body of the fable, why should the entire race still be considered superior to other animals simply because it counts among its members some eminent people? End of quote. So, according to my understanding, the final proof presented by the Hijazi man does not simply repeat the earlier arguments in the story. Here, the Hijazi man was referring to the perfect man and those around him. For example, regarding the individuals who preserve and sustain the earth, Ibn Arabi described a diamond-shaped hierarchy, the Qutb, two Imams, right and left, and one additional figure, watted pillar, each with their own function. At the same time, these four together form the supports autad of the cosmos. In other words, the Qutb, the spiritual pole around whom everything revolves, is at the very center of the world because he is the sole figure in his own category, Qutbiyya. However, he is also a part of the group of four autad, pillars, who in turn belong to a larger category, abdal, substitutes, followed by an even larger group, nuqaba, leaders, then a broader one, nujaba, nobles, and so on. The role of these figures is to protect the earth from harm and evil, with each having a specific position in the cosmic order. According to this model, divine manifestation descends upon the qutb, the cosmic axis, then spreads horizontally to the four sides, and from them it is distributed through the subcategories until it reaches all humanity. In short, humanity exists under the blessing of these holy men who serve as a link between God and humankind. Of course, this classification was introduced by Ibn Arabi many years after the Brethren of Purity, but in the Hijazi man's final proof, we see terms such as awliya, imams, and abdal, which suggest a similar idea. It is important to note that while the terminology, numbers, and function of these holy men vary in Sufi literature, I have provided Ibn Arabi's version for reference. Therefore, I must emphasize again that the figures mentioned in the final argument are different from those mentioned earlier. For example, while the humans previously argued that they had prophets among them, this claim was refuted because simply having a prophet does not make a people good. It is when people embody and apply a prophet's teachings that they move toward goodness. Or to put it more clearly, it is at the stage of fully implementing and living by a prophet's teachings that these teachings transition from potentiality to actuality. This is why Ibn Arabi highlighted the importance of the inheritor of the prophet and discussed the seal of wilaya. In other words, a person who follows the prophet's teachings and is transformed by them proves their validity and affirms their true existence. We can understand this by looking at many historical teachings or preachings that were never actualized in reality, which philosophically speaking makes them unreal or non-existent. This is why Ibn Arabi emphasized the idea of living Islamic teachings, of becoming like the Prophet who was a walking Quran, so that the teachings are fully realized and crystallized. So Ibn Arabi, like other Sufis, does not present such idea to challenge mainstream beliefs, as some might wrongly assume. On the contrary, he believes that the Quran is a perfect book and that using it perfectly, along with the following in the footsteps of the Prophet's life, can lead to the formation of perfect humans. However, this does not mean that everyone must do the same, nor does it imply that ordinary practitioners of Islam are incorrect. Accordingly, those who attack Ibn Arabi, perhaps unknowingly, implying that the Quran is not perfect, or at least this is how it seems to me. However, returning to the topic, I have to address Dr. Talili's point when she said, quote, the reader will readily note that every point made here has already been refuted. The presence of prophets has been taken as a sign of humans' immorality rather than virtue. End of quote. Yes, in the previous context, when humans presented the presence of prophets as a proof, it was refuted because it was merely an empty claim made by people who did not seriously follow the Prophet's messages. But when the prophets are mentioned in the final Hijazi man's argument, it is completely different because here the text refers to a group who genuinely live by these teachings. As you know, Arabs used to say, quote, know a person by their actions, not by their words, and by their eyes, not by their tongues. End of quote. The idea is that goodness should be seen in a person's body language rather than just on their tongue. The early Muslims understood this very well. For example, after the Prophet's death, they asked his wife about his behavior at home, and she told them that he was a walking Quran, meaning he lived according to everything he preached. Hence, his speech is truth. That is why we have many hadiths referring to the Prophet's reactions, often describing his body language when he said specific things. I mean, ancient Arabs would reconcile a man's speech, including his facial features, with his body language before judging him. As for Dr. Talili's other point, when she discussed the earlier proofs, quote, saints were said to prefer the company of other animals to the company of their own species members, end of quote. Here again, the mention of saints is different. For example, in the earlier context, the text referred to a type of saint that, as far as Ibn Arabi is concerned, is not a saint who has reached full realization. This kind of behavior, leaving everything behind and living in solitude, is criticized even by Orthodox Muslims. The very essence of Islam is to live in a harmonious society and above all to care for others rather than only for oneself. For example, Ibn Arabi referred to the behavior of completely separating oneself from others as not even reaching the threshold of the world of mysticism or something to that effect. Ibn Arabi did not advocate for complete withdrawal from society as a path to true mysticism. Instead, he emphasized the concept of the perfect human as someone who engages with the world while maintaining inner detachment and spiritual awareness. Some people reject all Sufism based on the saying, quote, there is no monasticism in Islam, end of quote. But even if this hadith, whose authenticity and meaning have been questioned by scholars, is taken as true, it refers to the idea of completely separating from society and not the temporary withdrawal. And we know well that many mystics were deeply involved in the problems of their society, to the point of sacrificing their lives in an effort to fix it. However, the category of saints mentioned in the Hijazi man's final proof is entirely different from the earlier one. It refers to saints who have attained a deeper understanding of fully caring for others, those who engage with society's problems without making a show of it. Unlike the devout mentioned in the earlier proof, I mean the ones that were criticized by the parrot, who do bad things yet show off their good side, the saint of the final proof are the complete opposite. They perform the most virtuous deeds but may deliberately appear bad in the eyes of others, ensuring that their actions are purely directed toward God alone. And this is the main feature of the Malamatiyya, as Ibn Arabi taught us. In Ibn Arabi's short work, the treatise on that which is not to be relied upon, as well as in the Meccan revelations, There are many sayings indicating that a mystic who avoids people entirely has not yet reached the depth of realization where they can see God in all things and act as a spiritual guide for others. So even if these real saints occasionally lead a solitary life, they do so only temporarily, seeking wisdom before returning to society to share and increase their knowledge by spreading it among others. Sufis believe that a divine gift not shared with others would turn into fire in the bosom of its holder. Again, the final group of saints is completely different from the ones mentioned earlier and refuted. Also, for example, when the Parisian man earlier posited about having poets among them, these poets are not in the same category as the poets mentioned in the final proof presented by the Hijazi man. The earlier poets were those who sought earthly gains and were criticized in the Quran, whereas the poets at the end were those who sang of divine love, such as Al-Hallaj, Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi, and Ibn Arabi, and many others, who were given an exception in the Quranic criticism. In Surah Al-Shu'ara, the chapter of the poets, the Quran criticized certain poets who misled people with their verses, often by promoting falsehood, deviating from the truth, and spreading immoral or harmful messages. However, the Quran also made an exception, quote, except those who believe and do righteous deeds and remember Allah much, end of quote. Imam Shafi'i, who was himself considered by Sufis to be one of the Abdal, said, quote, poetry is wisdom, end of quote, acknowledging that poetry, which when used correctly, can reflect beauty and truth, likely referring to this Quranic exception. To make my argument more clear, I will refer again to the earlier proof, when the Persian man bragged about having scripture reciters and devout people. He was harshly criticized by the parrot, who revealed that these individuals were hypocrites, outwardly appearing virtuous while being the opposite deep inside. Again, the devout people mentioned earlier are not the same as those mentioned at the end. In other words, the criticism was directed at the people of exoteric faith, Ahl al-Din al-Zahir, whereas the final proof referred to the people of Sufi faith, Ahl al-Din al-Batin. So the problem lies in the fact that those who seek to deceive others often disguise themselves as the purest and most righteous, making it difficult to distinguish between the two. Another important point to remember is that at the beginning of the story, while the animals were deciding on their spokesmen, particularly when the lion suggested that human wise men and intellectuals possess angelic characters, and therefore the animals should choose representative with similar traits to debate with them. The tiger objected. He argued that the intellectuals among the sons of Adam had long abandoned such angelic qualities, replacing them with demonic ones. Instead of engaging in reasoned discussion, they now argue rudely, scream in their debates, and express hatred toward their rivals, disregarding any ethical pursuit of truth. So the animals, as well as the jinn, know about these holy men, but they want to hear about them from humans themselves. For example, in Islamic tradition, there are narrations that mention how animals, trees, and even inanimate objects were aware of the Prophet Muhammad. Similar stories are also found in Sufi literature. Similarly to Ibn Arabi, other beings know the perfect man more than ordinary humans do. So, according to Ikhwan's perspective on creation, mineral substances are the most basic forms of existence, composed of the four elements: fire, air, water, and earth. Plants are made from these elements as well, but they are able to grow and expand in all directions. Animals, like plants, grow and nourish themselves, but they are further distinguished by movement and sensory perception. Humans share these traits with the plants and animals, but are set apart by their unique qualities of reason and discernment. Ibn Arabi, however, contrasted this hierarchy by highlighting the innate recognition of the divine in inanimate objects, particularly stones. Unlike other beings whose inherent knowledge of God is hindered by their desires, stones have the purest recognition of God. As the Quran stated, quote, others, meaning stones, are humbled in awe of Allah. End of quote. In this way, stones in their simplicity maintain a closer connection to the divine. In stark contrast, humans, despite their capacity for reason, are often distracted by desires and worldly matters, causing them to deviate from their inherent recognition of God. This is why the Quran criticized humans for being ungrateful. Ibn Arabi's comparison emphasizes that while all of creation acknowledges and worships God in its own way, humans, due to their free will and distractions, sometimes fail to do so. So the animals in our fable were compelling the humans to acknowledge or give credit to this holy man, while humans were not wholeheartedly willing to do so. There are Sufis stories about animals dying to save the lives of holy men. In our story, ironically, it is the animals who wish to teach humans and make them acknowledge the importance of these holy men. We must also remember in this context Rumi's story about the chickpea that celebrates its suffering while being boiled, cooked, and eaten by a human because it is part of its spiritual transformation. Through this, it will be freed from its earthly limits and become a thought of God in the mind of the holy man. In fact, we sometimes observe this in modern day debates. For example, an Orthodox religious person may be engaged in a debate with someone of a more modern mindset after being criticized as anti-scientific and feeling cornered by his opponent. The religious man might say something like, we have these mystics, philosophers, etc., even though based on his worldview, he does not truly accept the ideas of the figures he is referencing. But it is, I think, the undeniable power of truth that compels normal humans to acknowledge the importance of the people of truth. This is my understanding of Nietzsche's advice to speak the truth even if you face total rejection, because sooner or later humans will need as well as benefit from what you have offered. In other words, do what you are meant to do, and the power of truth will work to push people toward it. In our story, the power of truth used animals to guide humans toward that truth. Perhaps I am not expressing my point clearly, but something similar happens at the end of our story. That is to say, the animals and jinn were cornering humans into confessing the importance of these holy men. Let me repeat what the animal delicate and jinn sages said together when the Hijazi man presented his final proof. Quote, ah, humans, now at last you have come to the truth. You have spoken well and answered aright, for what you claim now is something indeed to take pride in. The deeds you cite are indeed worth performing. The lives and characters of these saintly persons, their manners and thoughts, the studies in which they are versed, are indeed worth vying for. But tell us, O humans, of the qualities and lives of these persons. Inform us of their insights and ways, their virtues and godly doings. If you know out of this. Enlighten us about this if you can. End of quote. So the story clearly states that the entire assembly fell silent, pondering the question, but no one had an answer. This is significant because the Hijazi man seemed to confess this fact to save face, yet he was forced into it. He knows that humans are somehow indebted to these figures, but he is not genuinely interested in glorifying them more, as he is also ignorant of their character. However, at this point, the enigmatic man, described as Persian by breeding, Arabian by faith, Hanafi by confession, Iraqi in culture, Hebrew in lore, Christian in manner, Damascene in devotion, Greek in science, Indian in discernment, Sufi in intimidations, is the one who raised and described these holy people. He is probably the representative of the universal man, according to the Ikhwan Safa, because he has taken the best qualities from every nation. Only such a man could recognize these holy figures. Yet his description fell short, for he showed that their goodness is too high to be fully captured. He said, quote, no one has adequately described their inmost core, end of quote. This, of course, is true, and it should be so. Only these holy individuals themselves can describe their inner divine thoughts and feelings, but they would never do so, and that is why they are great. They perform these actions purely for the love of God and not to show them to people. So how could others possibly know about them? For example, although many scholars attempt to study the lives and sayings of great men like Ibn Arabi, Rumi, and many others, based on their writings and what has been said about them, much of their inner logic and secret wisdom remains difficult to grasp. Hence, Sufis often speak of secrets that should not be revealed. In this context, we should remember that just before the end of the story, the debate turned to the variety found in both the human and animal kingdoms. This was not a coincidence, as it served to pave the way for introducing the perfect man, one who is described as embodying the best qualities of all beings. That is, what is dispersed throughout creation is unified in the person of the universal man. That's why, unlike earlier human merits that were each refuted by the existence of their opposites, the perfect human has no opposite. Some may mistakenly think that the devil is his opposite, but this is incorrect. The true opposite of the devil is the angel. Having said that, I believe Goodman and McGregor's remarks regarding the end of the story are more convincing. For example, they wrote, quote, the Ikhwan present their image of the perfect man as they bring their tale to a close, end of quote. In fact, Goodman and McGregor referred to the concept of the perfect man more than once. Elsewhere, they stated, quote, man's rise towards the angelic marks the realization of a human potential and the consummation of God's plan, end of quote. They also illustrated how, quote, in humans alone, by special grace, there is a choice between good and evil, end of quote. Moreover, they pointed out that the argument presented by the Hijazi might not be clear at first glance, but it refers to an old idea that humankind should be judged not by its worst members, but by its best. Regarding the men mentioned in the Hijazi man's final proof, they wrote, quote, the devices, awsiya of prophets are those whom God's messengers have appointed to carry forward their message. Both the term and the concept are redolent of Shi'i theology. In Sunni theory, the saints, awliya, are inheritors, warithun, of a given prophet's mission. But in Shi'i thinking, the prophetic role is passed by inheritance, as it were, to a designated successor. End of quote. Even though Goodman and McGregor wrote that quote, the narrative ends with no single pithy punchline, but by integrating its insights into a single thesis promised at the outset, end of quote, and caution that, quote, the means by which the Ikhwan highlight the moral standing of animals should not be overlooked, as if all that mattered were the outcome of an argument and not the reasoning that reached it, for an argument sets limits to its conclusion. End of quote. They nonetheless provided, whether in footnotes or commentary, valuable insights about the story's conclusion. Still, I believe more can be said in this direction. In particular, consulting Ibn Arabi's concept of the perfect human and those associated with him can help fill the gap in understanding the deeper metaphysical implications of the story's end. I mean, Goodman and McGregor also seemed puzzled by, or at least referred to, an irony at the end of the story. For example, regarding the final proof of the Hijazi man, when he said, quote, how do we stand on a par when among us we have prophets and their devices, imams, etc., end of quote. Goodman and McGregor wrote, quote, only now do the animals and jinn acknowledge that the humans have finally struck the truth and found something worth valuing, as if the humans had stumbled onto the answer to a riddle that lay in plain sight all along, too obvious to notice. End of quote. Elsewhere, Goodman and McGregor wrote, quote, it is the final irony in the case of the animals versus man that none of the many eloquent and thoughtful speakers present can adequately describe them, meaning the holy man. Yet the clear moral message is that human life itself is given its true purpose by taking up their path in pursuit of perfection. End of quote. Quoting Goodman and McGregor for the last time, they wrote, quote, the holy figures who come into view as the tale draws to a close are critical to the argument, for even immortality is no blessing if all it brings is eternal wrath. The saints, like the angel rulers mentioned by the chief Jinn philosopher, are models not of what human beings are, but of what we can become. That is why their intercession has weight. Indeed, their wisdom and their way of life are what make human lives uniquely precious. End of quote. I mean, this understanding of the end of the story is beautiful, yet I think the description actually refers to a specific group of people who are constantly working to atone for the ignorance and ingratitude of humanity, a specific type of people who labor tirelessly in striving to achieve the Quranic promise that the earth will ultimately be inhabited by virtuous people. In the process of working towards this aim, they sacrifice everything they have. They are not simply good, but rather creators of good values, so to speak. They give their all for the sake of these values, which is why they make serious impact in reducing the evil in this world. According to Ibn Arabi, the aforementioned group of earthly people has always existed and will continue to exist, with their representatives appearing to replace those who held the same role before them in each age, sustaining life. When considering such virtuous humans who endure a lot of pain and transform it into something positive for others, we can conclude that not creating the world would have been much more evil than creating a world with its existing evil. In this way, they break the paradox of evil. I mean, by comparing the limited pain they endure with the much greater and, in fact, endless impact they have on the world, humanity draws nearer to that Quranic promise. I mean, the representatives of these figures in each era, in a sense, are reducing evil and guiding humanity toward that high goal. So these great souls spend their lives suffering and dying for the sake of reducing the value of evil in this world and preserving humanity. Because, as Nietzsche said, though I cannot recall his exact words, but something like this: the very nature of great souls is to give nothing to others but hope and help, even if they live in hell, or something like that. In one of his hymns or prayers, Ibn Arabi said something interesting, although I cannot also remember the exact words. It was something like, "Please, God, give me the ability to go back through the circles of creation in order to get the knowledge of how it all started so I can share it with people and give them consolation." I mean, as far as I understood, he wanted to show humans that there is a divine beginning and an end to this temporary suffering of life, to give them consolation. Also, we know that Rumi lived in a tragic age during and after the destruction of Baghdad, but he turned his life into a light and hope, not only for Muslims, but for all humanity. Al-Jili, on the other hand, the author of The Perfect Human, referred to the Quranic verse, quote, "There is not one of you, but will pass through it," meaning hell, end of quote, by saying that the very holy man passed through it in this life. So such few altruistic individuals bring honor to the human species, even though, as the Quran says, most people are ignorant. Ibn Arabi often referred to this hadith Qudsi, quote, "I was a hidden treasure and I wished to be known, so I created all creatures that I might be known," end of quote. Hence, these great souls, in reaching toward that divine knowledge, offering their lives as the price to make that knowledge accessible to their fellow humans through their actions rather than speech. But although these great souls are in one way or another dying for the sake of humanity, they are often rejected by the majority of people who cannot fully understand their behavior. We can place this idea in a larger context. It is often the people who are attacked and ignored by their fellow human beings who are actually giving honor to the human species. This is why, at the end of the trial, the king of the jinn and the animals were convinced by the Hijazi man when he presented these figures and confirmed their important function. It is only when humans recognize the role and blessing of these unique figures that they can obtain the respect they seek. I mean, only when they start to recognize the greatness of these few great souls can they truly deserve to be treated with respect and likewise have the chance to be proud of being human. Until they do that, they will not even be able to logically defend themselves by claiming that they are in a higher place than animals. And this, as far as I understand, is the very lesson of the story. These are the important and valuable studies that I refer to. In this humble presentation, I have tried to add something to what these scholars have amazingly accomplished. So with this, I end my presentation. Thanks for listening. But before I end, I just want to leave you with one of the most powerful quotations I have ever read from Socrates. He said, quote, "Fix your mind upon this single truth. Nothing can harm a good man, either in life or in death." End of quote. According to my understanding, those who try to hurt such a person only end up harming themselves, whether they realize it or not. At the very least, when the humans in our story tried to ignore these virtuous figures, they were also ignoring something within themselves. And that's why, in the end, the power of truth compelled them to give these figures the recognition they deserved. With this, I'm done. Again, thank you so much.